Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm Jon Favreau.
I'm Jon Lovett.
I'm Tommy Vietor.
On today's pod, my conversation with one of President Obama's top economic advisors, Austin Goolsbee, about how to dig ourselves out of this mess. Before that, we'll talk about how the president is trying to rewrite the history of this pandemic, and we'll dive into the challenges that both the Trump and Biden campaigns are facing with just 6 months to go until Election Day. Woo! But first, Lovett, how was the show this week?
Great, love it or leave it. We had Ed Helms.
Nice.
We played a game. We had Olivia
Big
Nuzzi. Big get. We had Olivia Nuzzi, who talked about covering Trump from the briefing room. We played a game with preppers at home, and then I did the monologue on an app called Omegle, where you pull random strangers and then tell them a joke. And the good news is I saw 0 penises, which is also the bad.
I think that's called chat roulette.
It's also it's like chat roulette with fewer regulations. But the bad news is I didn't see any penises, you know?
Sorry,
Well, it looks like we got an episode title. Also, if you're looking for a fun break from the news, check out Hall of Shame, Crickett's podcast about some of the biggest scandals in sports history. In their latest 2-part episode, hosts Rachel and Rechna talk about the career of Meta World Peace, the basketball player formerly known as Ron Artest. Wow, I haven't thought about that in a long time. Listen and subscribe.
Malice at the Palace. It's a great one.
Yeah. Listen and subscribe to Hall of Shame now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to podcasts.
I will say those Hall of Shame episodes pair nicely with the Jordan documentary, which is the only thing I look forward to on a weekly basis now.
There you go. All right. Let's get to the news. As the United States nears 70,000 deaths and well over 1 million cases of COVID-19, the president could be preparing a national testing and contacts tracing strategy that would allow many of us to safely leave our homes. He is not. Instead, he is working overtime to try to blame his shitty response to the pandemic on China. During a Fox News town hall on Sunday night, Trump echoed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's assertion that the coronavirus originated in a Wuhan laboratory, saying, quote, "I think they made a horrible mistake and they didn't want to admit it." So, Tommy, Pompeo said he's seen enormous evidence that this is true. Last night, the Associated Press got a Department of Homeland Security report that said Chinese leaders, quote, intentionally concealed the severity of the pandemic in order to stock up on medical supplies for themselves. First question, how do we know whether to believe any of these people?
Enormous evidence, like a huge box full of, what does that even mean? So I think it helps to just talk about how like the blame China story has evolved over time, right? So version 1 was the Tom Cotton version and some others on the far right that suggested that the coronavirus was created by the Chinese as a bioweapon. And I think pretty much every scientist agrees that that is nonsense. They believe that this virus jumped from a bat to a human or a bat to another animal and then to humans. We get a lot of deadly viruses from bats like Ebola and SARS, so it makes sense. That's why labs like the one in Wuhan collect samples from wild bats and they do research on them. They want to find the next coronavirus like COVID. So version 2 is Pompeo and Trump saying scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were studying COVID. Somehow the virus escapes from the lab. Maybe a technician got it. Maybe there was an improper waste disposal. Who knows? So when it comes to that theory, unfortunately, it is not an absurd one. In 2015, the U.S. military accidentally shipped live anthrax spores instead of dead ones to other labs for testing. Oops, big mistake.
Yeah, big whoops.
In 2004, Chinese researchers researching SARS got infected because of their work. And then we also know that the Washington Post reported on leaked State Department cables that warned, in I think 2018, that the Wuhan lab had poor safety standards. It's worth noting that the Trump administration did nothing to address the security concerns that they were cabling back. And so version 3 of the story, of the blame China story, is that China concealed the severity of this virus to stock up on medical supplies themselves before the rest of us could. Here's the key point. Show us some fucking evidence, right? Because so far we have seen nothing. Trump said, it is my opinion that they made a mistake and they tried to cover it up. On ABC, Pompeo said, China has a history of infecting the world. What does that mean?
Yeah, what the fuck?
It's gross. It's a gross thing to say. He also had to admit that the intelligence community hasn't yet concluded that this virus leaked from a lab, And there are all these reports that the White House is directing the intelligence community to find links between the virus and the lab. And that's dangerous because when you're cherry picking intelligence to suggest, say, Iraq has WMD, you can get to a bad place, right? We should collect all the evidence, then come to a conclusion. So I'm not saying any of this to defend the Chinese government, but if your concern is really like lab safety, and there are a lot of reasons to be concerned, as we just discussed, this would be a good time to increase global cooperation and trust with the Chinese and try to address that underlying concern. But for Trump, this is about raging on China. It's about domestic politics. It's about pretending they're tough on Xi Jinping when we all know that Trump was saying Xi had done a great job. So this is just it's spin. And like, I hope the press will say to them, show us the evidence before we parrot your claims, because we just went through this time with Qasem Soleimani where they said that he this Iranian general was an imminent threat. He was going to take out U.S. service members on bases in Iraq, and so they assassinated him, and then they abandoned that pretext a couple weeks later. So we know that they lie about intelligence all the time.
So Lovett, let's say the virus did start in a Chinese lab and the Chinese did conceal the severity of the outbreak. How does that change Trump's culpability for the U.S. response? Because, as Tommy just pointed out, Trump received warnings that the Wuhan lab had massive security issues.
I think there's like two questions. One, what mistakes did China make around coronavirus, right? Did it accidentally come from a lab? Did they conceal the spread to protect themselves, or because they hoped they could deal with it without an international scorn or controversy? And then there's the question of why are they doing this? In the middle of a fire, you don't turn to another firefighter and say, you really fucked up this fire. And I want you to know when this fire's out, I'm coming for you. I'm going to blame you. And I'm going to make sure you pay for this fire. You say
backdraft 2.
Backdraft 2, back to the draft. And so we know why they're doing this. Trump is not doing this because he has concerns about international lab safety. He's not doing this because he wants to make sure that China is held responsible in the long term for their poor practices here. No, he's doing it because he wants a scapegoat. He needs a scapegoat, and he cares more about protecting his own image in the fighting of this virus than doing what's best to combat this virus right now. Because what Tommy said is true. If there is a problem in lab safety in China, well, that would be something we want to work with them on. That'd be something we want to talk about. What went wrong? What are the best practices we need to implement to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? But that's never what they're talking about. It's about punishment. It's about retribution. And it's about having a talking point. There was a memo that went out last week or the week before last or 6 months ago. I don't know because time has stopped. But it said that basically a Republican strategist was advising Republicans, when it comes to coronavirus, don't defend Trump, blame China. Right? Don't get stuck on defending Trump's bad decisions and bad behavior. Focus on China because they think that's a winning issue. And Trump understands that. Tom Cotton understands that. Mitch McConnell understands that. And so that's why Pompeo understands that.
I mean, it seems like there's a pretty simple middle ground here, which is blame Trump for believing China. Because how many warnings did Donald Trump have from our own intelligence agencies that China was possibly concealing the severity of the outbreak? Even I think Joe Biden in a debate warned Trump not to listen to the Chinese and everything they were saying about this. Also Trump's National Security Council had intelligence in January that predicted the virus would spread throughout the U.S., and they were suggesting keeping people home and shutting down cities in the winter, something Trump refused to do until March. And then he had all kinds of warnings like that. Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, said to Trump, this is going to be horrible. This could be a great pandemic. Trump called him alarmist. So it's he wants to just put the focus on China. And part of this is there's a parallel track where he's trying to get people to forget that he ignored warning after warning. All Trump says when you ask him, either at these press briefings or in these interviews about this, is he said, I had the travel ban. I put the travel ban in place from China. And he acts like as soon as he put the travel ban in place, everything went swimmingly since then.
Right. Yeah. It's a bit ridiculous. Like his position is a bit like China is a dangerous menace and they've defeated me.
Right. Yeah. I thought you were tough on China. I thought you were strongly tough and toughly strong on China,
And listen, I don't think any Democrat should go down this rabbit hole, but like Wuhan is a city in a province in China, and there's a lot of reporting that suggests, like, to the extent that there was a government cover up early on, it was the local government. And then when the feds came in from Beijing and they saw how badly they were handling it, they cracked down, they kicked the shit out of them, and made them apologize. And so, look, if there were a lab accident in Sarasota, Florida, because of some loose regulations from Ron DeSantis, I think we would all be pretty pissed off if the entire country was blamed for it. And there's a better way to manage China if you really think they're a huge threat to the planet, and there's a better way to deal with actual lab safety concerns.
I also do think. I was going to say also, I do think like a lot of the sort of foreign policy minded senators, Democratic senators, have been asked about this, and I think they've all had pretty like reasonable responses, which are there are serious questions to be asked about what happened and China's behavior in the outbreak of this pandemic, but that's not why they're asking the question. And we should remember that they're scapegoating the WHO and they're scapegoating China because they're embarrassed by their own performance. So I do think people are striking the right balance.
So, Washington Post reported that senior U.S. officials are beginning to explore proposals for punishing or demanding financial compensation from China for its handling of the pandemic. Tell me, what are the potential consequences of punishing China for hiding or downplaying the severity of this pandemic?
So, a couple of things. Like, one, it would be useful to be correct before we start alleging that the Chinese are somehow responsible in some way for creating a world-ending pandemic. So on top of that, they own, I think, $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds that if they started dumping those, it could create some challenges for our own economy, for interest rates over here. We have to work with them in any number of places at the G20, at the UN to get things done. Like, I don't think we want to escalate a fight with a country that is potentially going to be the place where COVID vaccines are manufactured one day. Like, there's a lot of reasons you could see this spinning out in a bad direction. And again, that's not a suggestion that we coddle China or we hide the truth. It's just that this war of words is stupid and self-defeating. And it's not backed up with an actual strategy where we are going to our allies, whether it's regionally with Japan and South Korea and others, or to Europe, and we're bringing all those groups together as a way to push back on China collectively. We're just pissing off everybody at once and seeing where the chips land.
Well, I mean, what is the goal? What is the goal?
Right.
Like, what are you trying to achieve by creating punishment around the outbreak of the virus against China? What is your actual agenda? Is it because you're so worried about another pandemic that you're trying to disincentivize bad practices around future diseases? Is that really the goal? Are you trying to extract concessions on other issues around trade, around intellectual property? Are you trying to just win a political fight at home? Like, what is the goal of having this fight with China right now? And I have seen no one explain what that goal is. No one.
No, I was just going to say, like, I mean, to your point, Lovett, about your analogy about putting out the fire, like, and you said this, Tommy, China could develop the vaccine very easily. We are also very dependent on China for pharmaceuticals. A lot of medical equipment comes from China, right? Like, as we are battling a global pandemic, we need more global cooperation than ever before. Right. And we can wait until after the pandemic's over and try to sort things out about who caused what and who's at fault and who's responsible. But as we are in a race for a vaccine that could save millions of lives, you probably want to cooperate with everyone else in the world right now.
I mean, look, the U.S., like, one last thing, just the U.S. under Trump has left a gaping hole for international leadership. China's tried to step into that hole, okay? And in a moment where China's reputation is faltering, where people are looking to blame China for this virus, and China's trying to make up for that by sharing health supplies and trying to prove that they belong sort of as this international leader on a world stage, America it could either step up and demonstrate its historic role in leading a global effort. But because Trump is unable to do that,
don't think that's going to happen.
The only option is to try to tear China down, to try to make sure China doesn't supplant the United States on the world stage, because they don't know how to do what the United States used to do in a crisis like this.
I would just say to Trump, let's start building the gigantic factories we will need to manufacture a vaccine at some point before we start pissing off the countries that have that capability today. That would be my focus.
Yeah, good advice. All right, so we are now less than 6 months out from Election Day. I want to talk about the challenges that both campaigns are facing. Let's start with the Trump campaign. There was a Washington Post story over the weekend that the Trump folks are still struggling to find a message now that we're headed towards depression levels of unemployment, and their own internal Republican National Committee polling shows the president trailing Joe Biden in the battleground states 45 to 48%. Trump's strategist told the Post that their only shot at winning is driving up Biden's unfavorable numbers, but they're also divided over just how to do that. Tommy, what are they struggling with here? What's the internal debate?
The debate is basically, do we use a bazooka or a flamethrower to scorch the earth? I mean, they know, like, that's their only path to victory is destroying Joe Biden. They want to drive down enthusiasm among Democrats, among young people, among suburban women. And the question is how. And the Washington Post reported that some people in the campaign, like Brad Parscale, the campaign manager, essentially want to say Joe Biden is senile. And it seems like Donald Trump himself is on board with that strategy because he is calling him Sleepy Joe. He constantly suggests that Biden doesn't write his own statements or tweets. They talk about him hiding, blah, blah, blah. The Washington Post reported that Kellyanne Conway in particular is worried that Trump is already losing ground with seniors, and they worry that mocking Biden's age could exacerbate that problem. I would respectfully suggest to Kellyanne that the bigger problem with seniors that they might have is rushing to reopen the economy and thus maybe killing them. I would deal with that first. But, they're also debating the strategy about whether to call Biden soft on China. And, the super PACs and others have put big money behind that. And so we'll see if it will work. It seems like a bit more of a bank shot to me. So whatever they're going to do, it's going to be pretty gross. I mean, just an aside here, there are a lot of folks on the left, including in the progressive media, who were circulating edited videos and just asserting that Joe Biden was in cognitive decline. And I would just congratulate all of them for helping lay the groundwork for these attacks, even though we've still seen no evidence that Joe Biden is in cognitive decline in any way. And reportedly, when he jumped on the phone with Donald Trump, Trump remarked to his own team, that guy didn't seem senile at all. So, great work, everybody.
Trump was like, maybe Twitter isn't real life. No, I mean, I think that raising mental fitness in a race against Donald Trump for president is quite a strategy.
Yeah.
I would add that as well. No, it's interesting in that piece. The other debate they're having is, does Trump wait until the convention or not to start going hard negative? Which is funny that, like, now they see Trump as not going hard negative. I mean, I guess he doesn't spend like every day tweeting about Joe Biden like he did Hillary Clinton. So I guess like more could be to come. They're also trying to debate like what kind of ads to run when. And this week, apparently, they're spending a lot of money on promoting Trump's response to the pandemic, which most people think is just to sort of please Trump because they don't think that's going to do any good, because they don't think that's really going to resonate with people that he has handled this in a really good way. So it is kind of interesting watching them just sort of like struggle for response. Lovett. One Trump advisor told the Post, quote, "One of the reasons we won in 2016 is because so many people hated Hillary Clinton. I'm not sure people hate Biden that much." What did you think of that? And how would you compare sort of the 2016 dynamics with 2020?
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I love Kellyanne Conway, putting on her white gloves and saying, like, I am not comfortable with what some of these ads, what Brad Parscale and these hooligans are trying to do to Joe Biden. I think it's bad strategy, but it just makes me uncomfortable. So, yeah, okay, Kellyanne. I do wonder if a little bit was just about sending a red flag to all the outside groups saying, destroy Joe Biden now. We need millions of dollars on the air to destroy Joe Biden. $1 million praising Trump on the coronavirus response is what they've put behind it. That will not help because that, like, if $1 million of ads praising Trump go up against hundreds of billions of dollars of free media about how bad he's bungled it, I don't think that'll move the needle. It's interesting, the Hillary-Biden comparison, because, we've talked about this. One of the reasons Joe Biden is the nominee is that in a fractured media environment, it is very difficult for someone to gain the kind of reputation and name ID and kind of deep knowledge that Joe Biden has. Like, he's from before, when we made people as famous as Joe Biden. So was Hillary Clinton. The difference between Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton is that Hillary Clinton stepped into this role as Democratic nominee with 30 years of attacks against her that had really made her kind of a vilified figure. I mean, I think the greatest trick Republicans ever pulled was pretending to like her for the 4 years she was Secretary of State. So Biden comes in with that inherent advantage, and they're finding it really, really difficult to chip away at that. And I think the pandemic makes their job that much harder, because the kind of relentless media coverage Donald Trump relies on to poison the well is just not available to him right now. Brad Parscale in one of these pieces points out himself that Donald Trump is not really attacking Joe Biden from the briefing room. And Donald Trump, without that podium, without that rally podium to kind of start throwing these out there, he's reduced to Twitter. But we've been living with Donald Trump tweets now for 4 years, and they just don't carry the punch they once did.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two major differences. One is the candidates, as you point out, and Hillary obviously had 30 years of attacks that she brought to the race. The other big one is the political dynamics of the race. Donald Trump is not the challenger anymore. Donald Trump is the incumbent. As the challenger, Donald Trump is very good at, trying to burn down the barn and talk about everything that politicians in Washington and government are fucking up. Now he is the government in the middle of the worst crisis of our lifetime, and he is fucking up. And it is very... Look, he knows and his team knows that they have to make this race about Joe Biden. It is very hard to make a race about Joe Biden, about any Democratic challenger, at a time where the incumbent is presiding over the worst crisis in our lifetime. It's just going to be hard to make it anything but a referendum. They'll try, but it's hard to do that.
This was in the Times piece, and I just want to read this because it was such it's such an obvious moment for Trump. In the phone call last week, for instance, Mr. Trump demanded to know how it was possible that a campaign that had been projecting strength and invincibility for 2 years was polling behind a candidate he viewed as extremely weak and at the moment largely invisible. The answer, according to nearly a dozen people, they talked to a dozen people to prove this, lies in the factors both beyond the president's control, such as the economic downturn and the spread of the coronavirus, as well as those in his control, namely his playing down of the coronavirus for several weeks, followed by his own performance in the briefing room. It's like, so why have your numbers gone down? Why are you in trouble? There's a Great Depression and there's a massive pandemic and you've mismanaged it. It's not that complicated.
The best part of that story was he was so mad at Brad Parscale, his campaign manager, when he showed him bad polling in swing states, that he threatened to sue them. He threatened to sue his campaign manager for bad polling. And then the guy had to come back a couple of days later from his mansion in Tampa with new polls that he'd cooked to show everything had improved, and then they patched the shit up. It's like, of course, no wonder he played down the coronavirus response. The guy can't look at evidence that is bad for him without lashing out.
I also just love the idea that Trump's looking at these polling and his presidency's on the line. There's so many people dead and sick. The country is in crisis. And he's like, I got to get back pay from this Brad Parscale guy. He's not earning that paycheck. I mean, I assume it was the kind of thing where he said I could sue, lashing out in the way that he does. Yeah. But it's still pretty amazing. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What are some of the warning signs for both candidates in this leaked RNC polling? Because the leak was quite extensive in the Post story.
I mean, look, there is some evidence in the Post story that the China attacks could work. They found that I think 51% of voters in 17 swing states blame China the most for the coronavirus. 24% blame Trump. So that, you could combine that with trying to call Biden soft on China and maybe put something together. I also think that there's some clear evidence that people don't know a lot about Biden besides that he was Obama's VP. And, that goes a long way, but you still risk getting defined. Voters also overwhelmingly think that Trump is not your average politician. They think of him as an outsider. Normally, I would think, that's really beneficial for Trump. I wonder if your average politician starts to sound pretty good in the middle of a botched pandemic. Also this whole thing where they're trying to suggest that Biden is senile, 45% saw Biden as more weak and confused. 44% saw Trump that way. So it's basically split. I mean, it's split along partisan lines. So, maybe
I love that question. I love that question. Who's more weak and confused? It's a tie. So that's our baseline. So that's our baseline. I do think basically the poll from the RNC kind of gives you the contours of the race. And it's pretty simple. Trump is an outsider, better at getting things done, better at handling the economy. Voters say Biden better understands average people, more honest, more compassionate, calm, and committed to making healthcare more affordable. So you see it
and he wins on intelligence and competence, which is something for a strategy based around his mental acuity.
Yeah, so you sort of see that, but in there you see Biden's strengths and you see Trump's strengths, and then you see their weaknesses, and you see that that's going to sort of be the axis. That's why you see people like Ronna McDaniel nay, Ronna Romney McDaniel, on television saying that, Trump built the economy and we're going to need him to bring the economy back, because their whole idea is you make the coronavirus something that happened to Trump, not something by his failures Trump did to the country.
Yeah, I will just end on reiterating Tommy's point. Like, in any other race, the fact that Trump is seen as not your average politician and Biden is seen as a normal, typical politician would be like the biggest flashing red light for me if I was in the Biden campaign. I do think, like, they're never going to make Joe Biden not your average politician on the Biden campaign. And Trump's always going to be viewed a little bit as an outsider. And so I think what you lean into if you're the Biden campaign is, we tried not your average politician for 4 years, and look where it got us. Don't you want someone in this moment who is competent, who is intelligent, who is caring, who is honest, that is going to be there and help guide the country through one of its worst periods? And I imagine that they'll probably lean into that to sort of make that contrast between the two candidates work for Joe Biden. All right, let's talk more about Joe Biden's campaign. The announcement of a vetting committee for potential vice presidential picks, a process that Biden said would be finished by July. The former vice president said they're looking seriously at over a dozen women, and the rumored shortlist is said to include Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, and Gretchen Whitmer, among others. We will speculate endlessly about this process from now through July. This conversation will just be the tip of the iceberg. Tommy, let's start by talking about how much you can separate out sort of substance, governing, and politics. How much does the VP pick matter, and sort of in what ways?
So, starting with governing, I mean, look, it's not a secret that Joe Biden is older than a lot of presidential candidates, right? Right? Like, he is openly ruminated about how maybe he is more of a transition period to a new generation of politicians. So in that sense, the person who you choose to be your vice president and to govern with you for at least 4 years is enormously important. Far more important than past vice presidential picks, because I don't know that we've ever heard a presidential candidate talk about a one-term pledge like this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't remember one. So in that sense, like, it's enormously significant. I also think that a lot of people will look at these picks and try to use them as tea leaves for how Biden may or may not govern, right? Like, if you choose Elizabeth Warren, that is a signal to a lot of progressives that progressive ideas will be heard on a daily basis, maybe hourly basis, in the Oval Office, that there will be someone in that Oval Office fighting for them in a way that they really like. Then you have some of the more moderate voices, and you might hear progressive groups feel like they're a little less enthused, right? Like, an Amy Klobuchar is seen as more of a moderate voice who won't necessarily be fighting for some of the things they care about. Politically, I think it's probably one of the most overthought decisions in the history of politics ever. You know what I mean? Like, I can't imagine anyone on this list or not on this list that would win or lose you the presidency. I think there was a poll over the weekend where I think a quarter of voters really care about the VP pick. Maybe on the margins, right? You can win or lose states. Like, if Gretchen Whitmer gets you over the hump in Michigan, that's worth it. That's a big deal. That's an important state that we have to win. If Stacey Abrams is able to inspire, African-American voters and young voters and turn them out in bigger numbers in 2016, that's a big deal. That'll get you over the hump and maybe win. But I think it's impossible to predict the future. So, like, ultimately, Biden's going to have to do what Obama did, which is just talk to a bunch of folks, figure out who he's the most comfortable with, and make a choice. And they'll vet those people in advance, and they'll try to make sure that there's nothing like politically explosive in their history that hasn't come out yet, and I don't think that it will. But look, I don't really know how you do that relationship or like vibe check with the vice presidential candidate over Zoom. That really sucks. I can't believe they have to do that.
Yeah, Lovett, you got anything to add?
It's just so nice to be talking about this. It's just sort of like, it's like from another time. Like, oh man, who's the is it going to be? Remember Gephardt on the cover of the Post?
Yes.
Like they put Dick. The New York Post said it that Kerry picks Gephardt, and he did not pick Gephardt.
He did not.
So, one thing that I was thinking about is basically like, to Tommy's point, right? It's really just sort of a kind of, in terms of how it affects the race, it's sort of a good enough proposition, right? If you just pick someone who everyone generally recognizes as being up to the job, it sort of stops being as big a story. And then if you pick someone like Sarah Palin or you pick someone like Dan Quayle, all of a sudden that becomes a really bad story for you, that you pick someone that might not be up for the job. I mean, all of the people you mentioned are serious national figures. I would say Stacey Abrams is the closest to someone who has a question mark in terms of national politics, but she makes up for any questions about that with her intelligence, grit, and clear competence and her ability to kind of run organizations and do smart politics. I remember in terms of Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, I very vividly remember being told because Tim Kaine delivers Virginia, and with Virginia, Hillary Clinton can't lose. So I'm always a little bit skeptical of the state play. That said, what a fun list. What a fun list of women.
I do think just from there's not a ton of evidence on this, but just from a political science standpoint, there is not that much evidence that sort of picking someone from a state or a region necessarily helps you all that much in that state or region. Of course, who knows? Like I said, it's a very limited amount of evidence for this. But I do think what you were saying, Lovett, basically this is a pick with, there's not a ton of upside, but there's a lot of potential for a downside.
Yeah.
So hello, Sarah Palin, mostly. But I think that Biden's age and the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis does make governing sort of more of a factor than it usually is. Can this person step into the role of president of the United States? And I think also after the primary we had for Democrats, it really is the major decision that Joe Biden will make before November that sort of gives us an indication of where he sees the party going and where he will lead the party both during his presidency and potentially for his successor. And on that note, there were two recent polls of Democratic voters from Data for Progress and CBS, and they show that Elizabeth Warren is the top choice among Democrats by double-digit margins, followed by Kamala Harris was second in both polls, and then Stacey Abrams and Amy Klobuchar were roughly tied for third. Now, some of this is possibly due to the fact that Elizabeth Warren, of that list, is the candidate with the highest name ID of anyone.
Right.
And that was true in the primary as well. After Biden and Bernie, she was number 3 in terms of name identification among both Democratic voters and all voters. But what did you guys think about those polls, and how much value is there in polls of only Democrats for a VP pick?
Yeah, I mean, look, my reaction was similar to yours in that I assumed it had a lot to do with name ID. I mean, there is value in the sense that if you can pick a VP that excites the Democratic base and makes them more likely to donate to you, volunteer for you, vote for you, tell their friends, all the things that we encourage people to do on a daily basis, that's really good. But, does it help you win a general election in a significant way? I'm not sure yet. I'm pretty skeptical of all the polling. I get why people do it. It's very fun to poll these things. It's fun to talk about. I would be happy with any of those candidates. So I'm sort of, agnostic almost. But yeah.
It's half the story, right?
I just petered out on my answer there. I was like, yeah, whatever.
It's like Joe Biden in the middle of a debate.
I know. I was like Biden debate. Fuck it, pick somebody. I don't care.
But it's half the story, right? Like polling of Democratic enthusiasm tells you, will this person excite people and turn them out? And then you need the other half, like how does this person do with the independents you'll need to build a winning coalition? It's also just to sort of add to what John was saying. It is always the case that when a presidential nominee chooses a vice president, they're in many ways choosing someone that they believe could be the standard bearer of the party. But it is never more true than right here, right? This is someone who, based on what Joe Biden is saying, and I think actually he's been really smart and deft about how he has introduced this idea of I'm only going to serve one term because I'm old, in a way that has a real kind of optimistic bent to it, right? I'm a transition candidate and I'll transition to a younger generation. He is choosing potentially the Democratic nominee in 4 years. That's an incredibly big decision, bigger than most presidents ever deal with, because 8 years is a long time, right? You don't know what's going to happen after 8 years, but 4 years, if this person is going to be the nominee in 2024, I want to live in that world. I'm going to knock on things. They're going to have to start campaigning 2 years into being vice president. So this is somebody who starts off as the presumptive, basically on their way to being the presumptive nominee.
Hey, thought experiment. It's 2008. Hillary Clinton wins the primary. She picks Barack Obama as her VP. She wins the general because financial crisis. Remember that? It was real bad.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wins re-election with Barack Obama as VP. Obama runs against Trump, kicks the shit out of him. We're not here. Now, for the world. Now, John, for you specifically, you'd be working directly for John Lovett in that speechwriting office. So it's something you should really think about.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's
yes,
my
but the
GQ profile now, bitch. All right.
But Tommy, the question is, how long would I have been working for John Lovett, and how long would John Lovett have been working since Hillary would have been impeached on day 10 over?
That's right.
Yeah, the Republican
That's right.
Congress.
And also, by the way,
True.
Yeah, and Trump only runs because of the racial backlash to having our first black president. So really, it's a fun hypothetical. It's a real slider situation. And I say we jump through until there are dinosaurs.
I mean, people going through the process, and candidates always say this, but I think it is true, and it'll be true this time. You should pick the person that you feel most comfortable with, the person who you believe can step into the role of president, and it usually will come down to that, though we're also facing an election where it's more important than ever before to win, right? Like, winning is going to be the huge consideration. So I think what the Biden campaign will obviously do is forget just about these Democratic voter polls, go into these swing states and start polling Biden and some of these nominees. And just to make sure, like, say Biden likes someone, all right, make sure that nominee, that potential VP nominee, doesn't lose you any voters, doesn't make things worse, right? If she doesn't, if it either makes no difference or it makes a positive difference, then you pick who you like, right? You pick who you believe in, and you pick who's going to be the best president. I think that's pretty clear. But I am sure they will do a ton of polling. It'll be Biden Warren versus Trump Pence in Wisconsin, Biden Harris versus and they'll go so on and so forth, and they'll do this a lot between now and then.
Just having a little moment of fantasy of imagining Elizabeth Warren debating Mike Pence, and I'm just going to think about that for like an hour, just to have it.
Honestly,
in my heart.
it's like Elizabeth Warren debating Mike Pence. I think Kamala would do a great job debating Mike Pence.
Stacey
Abrams. I mean,
Destroyed.
just those. Imagining those three debating Mike Pence is a fun debate to think about.